Ask unanimous consent to address the Senate as if in morning business and colloquy with the senator from South Carolina when he arrives.
Without objection.
I come to the floor this morning with my colleague, the senator from South Carolina, to put to rest once and for all the claim that we hear so often today that President Obama wanted to leave a residual force of U.S. troops in Iraq after 2011, that he tried his hardest to do so, and that Iraqi leaders prevented that from happening because they demanded that Iraq's parliament approve legislation to grant privileges and immunities for U.S. troops who would remain in the country. This is a very important aspect of the debate that is now going on, and it's a claim that made in growing desperation these days as it becomes increasingly clear for all to see that the president's mishandling of Iraq for the past 5 years, his consistent inaction on Syria, have now brought us to the verge of disaster. The Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, a more ambitious, more violent, and more radical offshoot of al-Qaeda, has now taken over a swath of territory in Iraq and Syria that is the size of the state of Indiana. It's the largest terrorist safe haven in history. ISI's offensive is now reigniting sectarian conflict in Iraq and threatening to erase the gains that nearly 4,500 brave young Americans gave their lives to secure, and that largely secure when the president took office in January 2009. In January 2009, the surge had succeeded. Iraq was not violent. The surge had succeeded. We had won the war. In the words of General McCAIN, we won the war and lost the peace, and that's a fact. The administration and its defenders are now scrambling to pin the blame for this catastrophic failure on anyone but themselves. They're trying to blame the Bush administration. They're trying to blame people like myself and the senator from South Carolina for voting to authorize the war, while conveniently forgetting that the Vice President Biden, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, his predecessor, Secretary Clinton, and many other Democrats still serving in this body voted for the war in Iraq as well. And while also forgetting that the senator from South Carolina and I began criticizing the Bush administration as early as 2003 for their mishandling of the war and calling for a change in strategy. In fact, I called in 2006 for the firing of the Secretary of Defense, Secretary Rumsfeld, because of the mishandling of the war. Indeed, the very strategy that was finally adopted with enormous success thanks to a great leader named General David Petraeus and a great ambassador by the name of Ryan Crocker. Most of all, the administration and its defenders are trying to blame the failures of Iraq on Iraq's leaders. To be sure, the lion's share of the blame for Iraq's current problems lies squarely with Prime Minister Maliki and other Iraqi leaders. But the administration cannot escape its own responsibility for the current disaster. This is something that the senator from South Carolina and I saw firsthand, and we stated over and over. And in order to set this debate to rest once and for all, we'd like to review the record. We predicted when all the troops were withdrawn that there would be the events that are taking place today. Not as rapidly, but we predicted that Iraq would fall into chaos if we withdrew all the troops and did not leave a residual force behind, as we have in South Korea, in Germany, in Japan, in Bosnia, and other countries after the conflict has ended. From its first day in office, the Obama administration signaled a hands-off approach to Iraq. It immediately pushed for a faster drawdown of U.S. forces than our commanders recommended. It appointed an ambassador to Iraq, Christopher Hill, who had no experience working on Iraq or serving anywhere in the Arab world. And I think he's a fine man. He had no experience. It adopted a hands-off approach of shaping Iraqi politics, which was demonstrated most vividly as it refused for months and months to take a hands-on approach with Iraqi leaders and help them broker the necessary compromises about their country's future in the aftermath of the 2010 elections in Iraq. Nowhere was the Obama administration's failure more pronounced than during the debate over whether to maintain a limited number of U.S. troops in Iraq beyond the 2011 expiration of the 2008 Status of Forces Agreement, or SOFA. The administration is quick to lay blame on others for the fact that they tried and failed to keep a limited presence of troops in Iraq. They blamed the Bush administration, of course, for mandating the withdrawal in the 2008 SOFA. This does not ring true, however, because as former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice has made clear, the plan all along was to renegotiate the agreement to allow for a continued presence of U.S. forces in Iraq. Everybody believed, she said in 2011, it would be better if there were some kind of residual force. Most of all, the Obama administration blames Iraqis for failing to grant the necessary privileges and immunities for a U.S. force presence beyond 2011. This, too, is totally misleading because, as we saw firsthand, Senator Graham and I traveled to Baghdad, to Erbil, and we met with Maliki, we met with Alawi, we met with Barzani. We met with all of the leaders of the main political blocs, and we heard a common message during all of these conversations. Iraqi leaders recognized that it was in their country's interest to maintain a limited number of U.S. troops to continue training and assisting Iraqi security forces beyond 2011. But when we asked Ambassador Jim Jeffrey and the commander of U.S. forces in Iraq, Lloyd Austin, in direct response to a question in a meeting with then Prime Minister, with Maliki, he said, okay, I want to know how many troops and what their missions are. We turned to General Austin. The answer was that they had still not made a decision. In Erbil, Barzani said he would fly to Baghdad. Alawi, the actual winner of the election, said that he would agree. And then after that, Prime Minister Maliki announced that if his partners agreed, which they did, he would agree to a residual force in Iraq. Now, those are just facts. Just days after the senator from South Carolina and I left Baghdad, Prime Minister Maliki, as I said, signaled his willingness, and it's a matter of record, public record, to a residual presence of U.S. troops if 70% of Iraqis agreed. The Kurds agreed, the Sunnis agreed, and Maliki himself had signaled his support. Had the United States and our Iraqi partners used our influence then and there, we could have lined up the remaining Shia support to enable Maliki to take this difficult decision. Unfortunately, that did not happen. Instead, months and months passed, and the administration made no decision on what missions and troops levels it would be willing to maintain in Iraq. By August 2011, the leaders of Iraq's main political blocs joined together and stated that they were prepared to enter negotiations to keep some U.S. troops in Iraq. Another entire month passed, and still the White House made no decision. During this long internal deliberation, as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Martin Dempsey later testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee, the size of a potential U.S. force presence kept cascading down from upwards of 16,000 to an eventual low of less than 3,000. By that point, the force would be able to do little more than protect itself, and Prime Minister Maliki and other Iraqi leaders realized that the political cost of accepting this proposal was not worth the benefit. So to blame this failure entirely on the Iraqis is convenient, but it misses the real point. The reason to keep about 10 to 15,000 U.S. forces in Iraq was not for the sake of Iraq alone. It was first and foremost in our national security interest to continue training and advising Iraqi forces and to maintain greater U.S. influence in Iraq. That core principle should have driven a very different U.S. approach to the SOFA diplomacy. The Obama administration should have recognized that after years of brutal conflict, Iraqi leaders still lacked trust in one another, and a strong U.S. role was required to help Iraqis broker their most politically sensitive decision. For this reason, the administration should have determined what tasks and troop numbers were in the national interest to maintain in Iraq, and done so with ample time to engage with Iraqis at the highest level of the U.S. government to shape political conditions in Baghdad to achieve our goal. I focus on this failure not because U.S. troops would have been engaging in unilateral large-scale combat operations to this day. In fact, they had won the conflict, and there was literally no further combat that the United States was engaged in. By 2011, they were no longer in Iraqi cities or engaged in security operations. However, a residual U.S. troop presence could have assisted Iraqi forces in their continued fight against al-Qaeda. It could have provided a platform for greater diplomatic engagement and intelligence cooperation with our Iraqi partners. It could have made Iranian leaders think twice about using Iraqi airspace to transit military assistance to Assad and his forces in Syria. And most importantly, it could have maintained the significant diplomatic influence that the United States still possessed in Iraq, influence that had been and still was essential in guaranteeing Iraq's nascent political system, reassuring Iraqi leaders that they could resolve their differences peacefully and politically despite their mistrust of one another, and checking the authoritarian and sectarian tendencies of Prime Minister Maliki. Now, Madam President, there's a need for immediate action. There is a need for immediate action. Every day that goes by, there is greater sectarian violence, there is greater success by ISIS. I do not believe they can take Baghdad, but look at the places they've already taken. And by the way, they're now threatening the major oil refinery in Iraq. I can assure you that will affect the world price of oil. There is a need because there is a more polarization of Iraq. There is a return of the Iraqi Shia militias. There is wholesale killing and slaughter going on, and it will get worse every single day. So is there any good option now in Iraq? No, there is no good option. The worst option is to do nothing. And apparently, according to the Wall Street Journal this morning, that is basically the approach that has been taken. We need to recognize that taking military action now is difficult because our intelligence has been so severely degraded since 2011, because ISIS is becoming so integrated with the Sunni tribes. We need to be careful about striking targets, even convoys in the open. There is a real risk of killing Sunni tribal elements and pushing the tribes closer to ISIS. And we also have to recognize that political change in Baghdad has to take place. But the question is, do we wait for political change? Every day we wait, there is more and more Iranian influence. The chief, one of the most evil people in the world, the chief of the Iraqi Quds Force, the Iranian Quds Force, has been in Baghdad planning with Maliki. So what does Maliki do when he doesn't see us giving him any real assistance? He turns to the Iranians. There are published reports of Iranian combat troops now coming into Iraq, as more and more of the radical ISIS people are flowing in back from Syria into Iraq. As I said, I don't believe I admit I was surprised at the rapidity of the success of the ISIS. But I also believe that the longer we wait to carry out some airstrikes, targets that we can identify, as difficult as it is, with a few people on the ground to identify those, it sends a signal psychologically over these people that are traveling long distances in the desert, ISIS, of an American aircraft flying overhead and perhaps taking some of them out if we have the sufficient information. That is a psychological effect on any enemy. Air power does not win conflicts. Air power alone cannot. But air power can have a significant effect on the morale of your people, on your capability of at least inflicting some damage, of changing the enemy's plans. So obviously, political reconciliation is the key. And we must do everything in our power to make sure that Maliki appoints a government of reconciliation and departs, but it can't be the prerequisite for U.S. military action because the events and time are not on our side. We also have to recognize that this is not an Iraqi conflict. This is an Iraqi-Syrian conflict now. The largest and richest center of terrorism in the history of the world is now in the Iraq-Syria area. They got hundreds of millions of dollars from the banks in Mosul, and obviously they acquired a whole lot of equipment during their incredible progress across Iraq. I urge my colleagues to have a look at the map of Iraq and Syria and look at the places that are now controlled by ISIS. And as I say, I don't believe they can roll into Baghdad in their vehicles with their guns mounted on them, but they sure as heck can cause a lot of problems. Bombings, assassination, the radicalization of these Shiite militias. If one of these Shiite shrines is damaged by ISIS or by Sunni militants, you are going to see a very bigger explosion, which will bring us back to the days of 2003, 4, 5, and 6, before the Anbar Awakening. These same Sunni that were part of the Anbar Awakening that joined us in putting down al-Qaeda are now being polarized by Maliki, the Shiites, and also the chickens are coming home to roost as far as Maliki is concerned because of the continued marginalization and persecution of Sunnis all over Iraq, much less in Anbar province. So we have to act. We have to act. We must act. And I know that there are always people who will tell our leaders reasons why we can't. But I know of no military expert that believes that doing nothing is a recipe for anything but further chaos and eventually threats to the United States of America. Our Secretary of Homeland Security has stated it. Our Director of National Intelligence has stated it, that people in this part of Iraq and Syria will be planning attacks on the United States of America. That's their view. It also is mine. But we can do some effective airstrikes. We can, and it's more difficult because of our degraded intelligence. By the way, when we left Iraq, all of those intelligence capabilities were shut down. To make it more effective and mitigate the risk that could push Sunnis deeper into the arms of ISIS, they got to be accompanied, as I mentioned, with a limited presence of special forces on the ground. These forces could gather intelligence to improve our targeting of IS control, airstrikes from the ground, and provide advice and consent, advice from the Sunni tribes. I believe that several other steps could be taken. One, who is the most respected people in Iraq today? Probably David Petraeus and Ryan Crocker. Send them back. Send them back those that work so closely with the Sunni, like General McFarland, then Colonel McFarland, the people that built up these long relationships with the Sunnis. Send them back. Maliki will listen to David Petraeus and Ryan Crocker. Send them back. Send back a planning team, a group of really smart people that can work with what's left of the Iraqi military leadership and identify a tactics and strategy that can reverse this tide of the ISIS, which is about to engulf them. Send some air power. Send some air power with targets we can identify. And I am fully aware of the risks associated with it. I want to repeat over and over and over again, there are no good options. And also, make it very clear to Maliki that his time is up, that he must arrange for a transition. Now, the Shia won the election, the majority of the votes, not a the majority of any of the parties, but not an overall majority of the vote. This new government could be headed by a Shia, but it has to be a Shia that can reach out to the Sunni and bring them together in a government of national reconciliation. All of my colleagues have seen the pictures of the young Shia who are now joining up and are ready to die. The movement from Basra of the Shia militia organizations, which had been put down before, that are now rising from the ashes. You've seen the pictures, the horrible pictures of the executions that are taking place and the incredible displacement, 500,000 people from Mosul alone. The Kurds have now taken Kirkuk. That's an ambition that they've had for the last 50 years. You will see now a drive for total Kurdish autonomy from the government in Baghdad. And they will be making their own deals as far as oil is concerned. And the Kurds will now be pursuing their centuries-old ambition for a Kurdish state, which will cause the Turks to be very concerned. I also want to point out that if ISIS continues to succeed and they move back and forth to Syria, they will now pose a direct threat, first of all, to Jordan, and then to other Gulf states, and finally, eventually, Saudi Arabia. But those who are right next to Iraq will be most under threat. So I urge the President and I urge my colleagues to understand the gravity and the seriousness of this situation, to understand that if ISIS succeeds, even without taking Baghdad, and they are able to establish this, what they call a caliphate in the Syria-Iraq area, larger than the state of Indiana, and are able to train, equip, and export terror, not only throughout the region, but throughout the world, it will pose a direct threat to the security of this nation. I'd like to thank the senator from South Carolina for showing up.
I'm sorry.
It was late. Actually, I had an exchange with General Dempsey about this very topic. Senator McCain, do you see any scenario where ISIS is militarily stopped and that the Iraqis can retake ground lost to ISIS without U.S. air power being involved?
I know of no military expert that believes that without the use of U.S. air power that they will be able to anytime soon regain the lost territory, which is a sizable part of Iraq.
Did you hear President Obama say it's unacceptable for radical Islamists to have safe havens in Iraq and Syria? Did you hear him say that?
No, I did not, but I did hear him say on December 14, 2011, we're leaving behind a sovereign, stable, and self-reliant Iraq with a representative government that was elected by its people, and other quotations throughout the
My point
campaign.
is, don't you agree he's right? It is not acceptable for our national security interest for ISIS to have a safe haven in Syria and Iraq that could run from Aleppo to Baghdad, that's not a good thing for us.
I totally agree.
Well, if it's not a good thing for us, how do you change it? Give me a scenario where we put these folks on the run in Syria and in Iraq without American air power. Give me a scenario where political reconciliation in Baghdad has a snowball's chance of hell of it succeeding as long as they're losing on the battlefield. Give me a scenario where the battlefield turns our way without U.S. air power. I can give you a scenario where it begins to turn on the battlefield. Iran comes in with great numbers. The most likely scenario to stop ISIS is Iranians getting involved with Shia militia. Does that bother you, Senator McCain?
But I'd also like to point out something the senator from South Carolina knows and I know. The air power has a psychological effect. When an aircraft flies over the enemy, they are going to do things differently if they fear that they're going to be hit from the air. As we all know, air power does not determine the outcome of conflicts. but they sure are important in the battlefield equation.
Well, is it fair to say the Air Force in Iraq is grounded for all practical purposes?
Not only grounded, but a lot of the air assets, I understand, like Apache helicopters, are in the hands of ISIS.
So, to the President, we agree with you that Iraq matters. We agree with you it's not in our national security interest to have ISIS occupy territory from Aleppo to Baghdad. But here's what's a mystery to me. How do we turn this around unless you stop their advance inside of Iraq and you go after them in Syria? And as to political reconciliation, I completely agree that that is the ultimate change that needs to occur, that airstrikes alone will not get us to where we want to go, but it's a chicken and egg concept for me. Can you imagine a scenario, Senator McCain, where we can get all the parties together when ISIS is winning on the battlefield?
That's why I was amused by various commentators who have been consistently wrong, including one in the New York Times today. All we need to do is have everybody sit down together. A total misreading of the situation.
Here's the problem of that. To go to a meeting in Baghdad, you're likely to get killed trying to get there. Who's going to sit down at a meeting in Baghdad when everybody's getting killed based on sectarian differences? So my advice would be to use American air power before it's too late as part of a coordinated diplomatic effort. That American air power is part of diplomacy. That may sound counterintuitive, but it makes perfect sense to me. Diplomacy cannot succeed unless you change the momentum on the battlefield. But when you drop a bomb, you need to have a game plan beyond the bomb falling, and that would be a regional conversation. And can you see how Maliki can put Humpty Dumpty back together again?
I cannot. And that's why he has to agree to a transition.
I would not send $1 to Iraq. I would not send one soldier to Iraq, one airman to Iraq, until we understand over the arc of time, Maliki's got to go. I've been there more times than I can count. Maliki did some good things on his watch, but he has become a political leader that cannot bring the country together. But that, to me, is a concern that's addressed after you stop the momentum on the battlefield. Senator McCain, do you believe it's still possible that the Kurds, the Sunnis, and the Shias that we know fairly well can regroup and reconcile with themselves if we act decisively?
I'm totally confident that they can. That is what the country was held together for long periods of time, but we obviously can't. Could I ask my colleague, I began, before you arrived, talking about this business of that the allegations that
Yes.
somehow that it's the Iraqis' fault that we didn't leave a residual force in Iraq. And I went through our meetings with Maliki, with Barzani, with Alawi, how they were all committed to maintaining residual force. Could you just, for the record, recount the Senate Armed Services Committee hearing where you directly questioned General Dempsey about this dire issue after we had withdrawn?
Yes, I'll be glad to, and just put it in context. In 2008, we signed a strategic framework agreement. It was envisioned that we would negotiate a follow-on force with advisors, some special forces units to secure our nation as well as to protect our gains. In the process of trying to get the Iraqis on board, Hillary Clinton called me to ask if you and I think Senator Lieberman, maybe he didn't go, I can't remember, would go over there and talk to Barzani, to Alawi, and Maliki. And we said, sure, we'd be glad to. Here's what I found. I found in the meeting with Prime Minister Maliki, who was very open-minded about a follow-on force. Barzani said, I'll take 250,000 Americans. That was never a doubt about where the Kurds were at. Alawi understood, the Sunnis understood the need for a follow-on force. It really was about the Shia politics. After we got back, Maliki said, if the other groups will do it, I will do it. But he says, what kind of force are you talking about, Senator Graham? Ambassador Jeffries.
This wasn't a meeting in Baghdad.
This was a meeting in his office. He asked me, what kind of force are you talking about? I turned to General Austin and Ambassador Jeffries, and I asked them, what's the number? Answer the Prime Minister's question. We're still working on that. And the Prime Minister looked at me, and said something to the fact, well, I don't know what I'm supposed to be agreeing to. We come back to Washington, we go to the Vice President's house, we talk to Mr. Donlan saying they need a number. Sometime, and they said they would get back to us about the number. I'm still waiting on that phone call. During my questioning of General Dempsey about the follow-on force, I asked him, General Austin recommended somewhere in the 18 to 20,000 range. The Pentagon got down to 10, and below that they felt very uncomfortable. I asked him directly, did the number cascade down, or did the number go down because the Iraqis said, that's too many Americans, we don't want that many Americans on our soil? He said, no, sir, the numbers kept cascading down because the White House kept changing the number. So I want the record to reflect that in a meeting with the Prime Minister of Iraq, when he asked me how many troops we're talking about, we couldn't give him an answer, and I want the record to reflect the chairman of the Joint Chiefs said that the numbers went down and down and down, not because the Iraqis were saying no, because the White House kept lowering the number to the point that it got to be absurd. And we will prove that over time.
Well, I find it good. I see that our colleague from Florida is waiting. I think I'd like to have the senator from South Carolina summarize. The cost of inaction or doing nothing is the greatest cost we can incur. The situation on the battlefield is not only terrible, but the polarization of the different groups in Iraq is growing worse by the hour. We are seeing the resurgence of the old Shia militias that we had put, that thanks to David Petraeus, we had put down before. Iraq was largely under control thanks to David Petraeus, Ryan Crocker, and the surge in 2011. If we had left, and it's a fact, and if we had left that residual force behind, history would be very different. And I would add one other comment. We cannot ignore Syria in this situation. We have to understand that Syria is now part of this huge area, the size of the state of Indiana, which is governed by ISIS. Madam President, I yield the floor.